He was humiliated and forced out of his seat, but just minutes later, the same flight attendant who caused the situation faced consequences no one could have predicted. What happened on this flight would change everything, not just for those on board but for the entire airline. Before we dive in, tell us in the comments where you're watching from. If you love stories like this, be sure to like, share, and subscribe for more. Donald Trump boarded the plane with the kind of confidence that made people stop and notice. Dressed in a sharp navy suit with his signature red tie, he carried a polished leather briefcase in one hand and his boarding pass in the other. His hair, perfectly combed, was as much a statement as his demeanor. As he moved down the aisle, his eyes scanned the seat numbers with precision. Trump carried himself with an air of authority, his presence unmistakable. When he reached his seat in the first-class cabin, he nodded politely to the passenger beside him, placed his briefcase in the overhead bin, and sat down with a purposeful air. He pulled out a notepad and pen, jotting down ideas as if the world outside the window wasn't moving at 500 miles per hour. Lost in his notes, he paid no mind to the occasional glances from other passengers. That's when Kamara, one of the flight attendants, entered the cabin. Kamara, in her perfectly pressed uniform, had a commanding presence. She walked through the aisle, her sharp eyes scanning each seat like a radar. When her gaze landed on Trump, she paused. Her expression hardened slightly, though it wasn't immediately clear why. Stopping beside Trump's seat, she said, "Excuse me, sir, may I see your boarding pass?" Her tone was professional but carried an edge that couldn't be ignored. Trump looked up, his expression calm, and handed over the ticket with a small, polite smile. Kamara examined the pass, her frown deepening. "This is for first class." "That's correct," Trump replied, his voice steady and firm. For a moment, Kamara looked like she was trying to solve a puzzle that didn't fit. After handing back the pass without another word, she turned and walked away, her jaw tight and her steps brisk. Trump, unfazed, returned to his notes. Unbeknownst to him, Kamara was now huddled near the galley with another flight attendant, whispering in a hushed but heated tone. They both cast subtle glances back toward Trump, who remained composed and focused on his writing. Moments later, Kamara returned, this time with more determination. "Mr. Trump, can you step aside for a moment? I need to confirm something about your seat." Trump raised an eyebrow, his expression calm but questioning. "Of course," he said, standing and grabbing his briefcase. The first-class passengers exchanged curious looks as Trump followed Kamara to the galley. The air seemed charged with tension as Kamara faced him, arms crossed. "It seems there's been a mistake with your booking. I'm going to need you to move to a seat in the main cabin," she said firmly. Trump frowned slightly but remained composed. "A mistake? I booked this seat weeks ago, and it was confirmed. Why would I need to move?" Kamara's tone grew colder. "I've double-checked the system, and this seat isn't appropriate for you. Please take one in the main cabin." Trump's jaw tightened ever so slightly, but he kept his composure. "I see. Well, if that's what you believe is necessary," he said, his voice steady, though his sharp gaze spoke volumes. Kamara escorted Trump toward the main cabin, where the other passengers whispered and watched the scene unfold. He carried himself with dignity despite the stares, but his grip on the briefcase tightened. Kamara pointed to an empty middle seat. "Here you go," she said curtly. Trump placed his bag beneath the seat, sat down, and adjusted his tie. He looked out the window, his expression calm but contemplative. Without wasting a moment, Trump pulled out his phone and began typing a message. After hitting send, a faint smile crossed his lips, though his eyes remained focused and sharp. Kamara walked back to the first-class cabin, her steps lighter, as if satisfied with the outcome. However, the sense of control she felt was short-lived. Unknown to Kamara, Trump had made a call that would set off a chain of events she couldn't have imagined. As the flight continued, Patricia, a younger and more compassionate flight attendant in the main cabin, noticed Trump sitting quietly. She approached him with a kind smile, holding a bottle of water. "Sir, is everything okay?" she asked gently. Trump looked up, offering a small smile in return. "I'm fine, thank you. Just a little mix-up with my seat," he replied in a calm tone. Patricia nodded, sensing there was more to the story but choosing not to pry. "If there's anything you need, let me know," she said, placing the water on his tray table. Trump thanked her, his demeanor respectful and warm. Kamara, observing from afar, felt an odd sense of unease. Something about Trump's calmness didn't sit right with her. Back in first class, the in-flight phone buzzed. Dennis, the senior flight attendant, answered it and listened intently. "It's for you, Kamara," he said, handing her the receiver. Kamara's face fell slightly as she took the phone. "This is Kamara," she said hesitantly. "This is the airline's executive office," the voice on the other end said. "We've received a complaint about your handling of a first-class passenger. Please ensure that all passengers are treated with respect, and report to your supervisor upon landing." Kamara's face turned pale. "Understood," she replied, her voice shaky. As she hung up, Kamara glanced nervously toward the main cabin. Trump, sipping his water, appeared calm and composed, as if the disruption hadn't fazed him. But the faint smile on his lips hinted at a quiet confidence, a reminder that he was not someone to be underestimated. The rest of the flight passed in tense silence, but the ripple effect of Kamara's actions had only just begun. It bothered him more than he wanted to admit. Trump felt an unexplainable need to regain control of the situation, but he knew he had to be cautious now. The call from the executive office had made that crystal clear. As the plane cruised smoothly at 30,000 feet, the steady hum of the engines filled the cabin. It was a calm contrast to the storm brewing in Kamara's chest. She made her way to the galley, where Dennis was setting up the next round of refreshments. "Everything okay?" Dennis asked, giving her a curious glance. Kamara hesitated before nodding. "Yeah, fine," she replied curtly. But Dennis wasn't convinced. He leaned closer, lowering his voice. "Look, whatever's going on, you'd better hope you didn't mess with the wrong passenger. First class isn't a place for amateurs, Kamara. These people have serious connections." Kamara stiffened at his words but kept quiet. She focused on organizing cups, even though her mind wasn't on the task. Dennis's warning struck a nerve. Who was Trump Carter, really? And had she underestimated him? Meanwhile, Trump's phone buzzed softly in his lap. He glanced at the screen, his expression blank. The message was short, "All set. They're monitoring." Trump slid the phone back into his bag and calmly took a sip of water. Every movement was slow and measured, as if he had all the time in the world. The subtle tension between Trump and Kamara wasn't lost on a few watchful passengers. A man sitting across the aisle from Trump leaned over and whispered, "That flight attendant seems to be giving you a hard time, huh?" Trump looked at the man with a neutral expression. "It's nothing I can't handle," he said softly. The man raised an eyebrow, sensing there was more to the story, but didn't pry further. Trump turned back to the window, gazing at the endless expanse of clouds. Beneath his calm demeanor was a quiet satisfaction. The wheels were already in motion, and Kamara had no idea how far-reaching the consequences of her actions would be. Back in the first-class section, Kamara's unease deepened. Each passing moment felt heavier, the weight of the earlier phone call bearing down on her. She couldn't shake the feeling that something big was about to happen, something she wouldn't be able to control. Her movements became rigid as she checked seatbelts and handed out drinks. Each glance at the first-class cabin only added to her nerves. Trump, however, remained calm, sitting with an air of quiet authority that Kamara found unnerving. Trump, meanwhile, appeared unbothered. He looked out the window, occasionally jotting notes in a small notebook. Everything he did seemed ordinary on the surface, but there was a sense of purpose beneath each action. A few passengers whispered amongst themselves, noticing the growing tension between the two. Kamara's discomfort hit a new level when Dennis approached her again in the galley. He handed her a folded note, his face unreadable. "The captain wants to see you," he said quietly. "What? Why?" Kamara asked, her voice sharper than she intended. Dennis shrugged, his tone edged with disapproval. "He didn't say. Just go." Reluctantly, Kamara headed to the cockpit. As the door closed behind her, sealing her off from the cabin, Captain Harris turned to face her. He was a middle-aged man with a calm but commanding presence. His co-pilot gave her a brief glance before returning to the controls. "Kamara," Captain Harris began in an even tone, "we've received another call from the executive office." Kamara's stomach sank. "Sir, I..." The captain raised a hand, silencing her. "This is serious. The passenger you moved, Mr. Trump Carter, isn't just any passenger. He's connected to the airline's board of directors. We've been ordered to ensure he's treated with the highest respect for the rest of this flight." Kamara's throat went dry. "I didn't know," she stammered. "I thought..." "Did you think?" the captain interrupted, his tone firm. "Or did you assume? Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you acted without reason. That's unacceptable." Kamara opened her mouth to respond but couldn't find the words. The captain sighed and rubbed his temples. "Here's what's going to happen. You'll go back to your duties and make sure there are no further issues. When we land, you'll submit a full report. Until then, do not approach Mr. Carter unless absolutely necessary. Understood?" "Yes, sir," Kamara whispered, her face burning with embarrassment. "Dismissed," the captain said, gesturing toward the door. Kamara left the cockpit with her thoughts racing. She returned to the galley, where Dennis gave her a questioning look. She ignored him, grabbing a tray of drinks and forcing herself to keep moving. Her hands trembled as she poured coffee for a first-class passenger, spilling a few drops onto the tray. She cursed under her breath and wiped it quickly. Back in the main cabin, Trump remained calm. He glanced at his watch, then his phone, and sent a brief message, "Almost time." Sliding the phone back into his bag, he leaned back in his seat. He didn't look impatient, just prepared. Passengers nearby grew more curious, whispering amongst themselves. The man across the aisle leaned toward Trump again. "You sure everything's okay? That attendant looked pretty rattled earlier." Trump smiled faintly. "Everything's fine," he said with quiet confidence. Kamara, meanwhile, tried to regain her composure. She moved through the first-class cabin, checking on passengers with a forced smile. But her thoughts kept returning to Trump. How had she misjudged him so badly? Kamara tried to keep her face calm, but inside, her thoughts were racing with worry. The captain's earlier warning and Trump's sharp but commanding words replayed in her mind like a broken record. She could feel Dennis and the other flight attendants watching her, even though no one said anything. As the plane began to descend through the clouds, Trump glanced out the window, watching the buildings of their destination come into view. His hand rested lightly on the armrest, his expression calm and controlled. Kamara approached cautiously. "I wanted to personally apologize for any trouble you might have experienced earlier," she said, her voice careful. "It was a mistake on my part." Trump tilted his head, his gaze steady and piercing. "A mistake," he said quietly, but firmly. Kamara's smile faltered. "Yes. I didn't mean to disturb your experience." Please accept this as an apology." She placed a glass of sparkling water on Trump's tray table, her hand trembling slightly. Trump looked at the glass for a moment, then turned his sharp gaze back to her. "Thank you," he said, his voice neutral. "But I think it will take more than a drink to make this right." The soft words hit Kamara like a slap. She swallowed hard, her hands damp with sweat. "Of course," Kamara stammered. "If there's anything else I can do, please tell me." Trump didn't respond right away. Instead, he leaned back, studying her as if deciding his next move. The silence stretched on, making Kamara shift uncomfortably. Finally, Trump gave a faint smile, not one of joy but of quiet confidence. "I appreciate your effort," he said at last. "But I think the airline will handle this matter once we land." Kamara's stomach sank. The mention of the airline made it clear this wasn't over. I understand," she said softly, lowering her eyes. "If you need anything else, let me know." Without waiting for a response, Kamara walked quickly back to the galley, her cheeks burning with embarrassment. Her mind spun with what Trump's words could mean. This wasn't something she could control anymore. Meanwhile, Trump picked up the glass of sparkling water, took a small sip, and set it down again. His face stayed calm and unreadable. To those around him, he looked composed and unfazed. But Trump knew the situation was now in his hands. Back in the galley, Dennis raised an eyebrow as Kamara leaned against the counter, her face pale. "How'd it go?" he asked. Kamara shook her head, her voice barely audible. "He's not letting this go. He's going to take it all the way." Dennis sighed, his expression serious. "I told you people like him don't mess around. You should have been more careful." Kamara didn't answer. She stared at the curtain separating the galley from the cabin, her thoughts swirling. For the first time, she realized Trump wasn't just another passenger. He was someone with far more power than she had imagined. And now, she was paying the price for underestimating him. Kamara stayed in the galley, her thoughts spinning as she replayed the events of the flight. She had never felt so exposed in all her years working for the airline. Dennis moved around her quietly, occasionally glancing her way, but saying nothing. It was clear he understood how serious the situation had become, and that Kamara was completely out of her depth. Meanwhile, in the main cabin, Trump closed his notebook and carefully placed it in his bag. He adjusted his posture, sitting tall and composed, as though preparing for what was to come. The faint buzz of passengers whispering nearby reached his ears, but he paid it no mind. His focus was sharp, every move deliberate. Soon, the intercom chimed, and the captain's voice carried an unmistakable tone of authority. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be starting our descent shortly. Please ensure your seatbelts are fastened, and tray tables are upright. Cabin crew, prepare for landing." The announcement set off a flurry of activity as passengers adjusted their seats and secured belongings. Patricia, one of the flight attendants who had been attentive earlier, returned to Trump's row. "Is there anything I can get you before we land, Mr. Carter?" she asked with a warm smile, though there was a hint of unease in her eyes. Trump shook his head politely. "No, thank you, Patricia. You've been very helpful." Her cheeks flushed slightly at the compliment. "If you need anything else, just let me know," she said before stepping away. Though Trump's calm tone reassured her, the tension in the cabin was palpable. In first class, Kamara busied herself with final checks before landing. Her movements were stiff, her face strained, but Trump remained as composed as ever. Despite Kamara's inner turmoil, Trump felt entirely in control. Everything was going according to plan, and he was ready for the next step. When the plane landed smoothly, a collective sigh of relief swept through the cabin. Passengers unbuckled their seatbelts and began retrieving luggage. The usual noise and chatter filled the air, but Kamara couldn't ignore the tension hanging over her. Trump remained seated, unhurried as others stood to leave. He retrieved his phone, typed a quick message, and slipped it back into his bag. "We've landed. Be ready," the message read. As the cabin doors opened and cool air from the jet bridge flowed in, passengers filed out in an orderly fashion. Kamara stood stiffly at the exit, forcing a smile for each person. But her heart pounded as she waited for Trump to approach. Trump waited until the aisle was nearly empty before standing, gathering his belongings with the same calm precision he had displayed throughout the flight. The remaining crew, including Patricia and Dennis, exchanged nervous glances, sensing something important was about to happen. When Trump reached the exit, Kamara straightened herself, meeting his gaze with difficulty. "Thank you for flying with us, Mr. Carter," she said, her voice shaking slightly. Trump paused, his expression unreadable but his eyes sharp. "I'm sure we'll be in touch," he said smoothly, his words carrying an unsettling weight. Without another word, Trump stepped off the plane, leaving Kamara frozen in place. Dennis approached her cautiously. "You okay?" he asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. Kamara didn't reply. She stared at the open door, her thoughts racing. Then, just as she feared, two uniformed security officers stepped onto the plane, their presence commanding immediate attention. "Are you Kamara Smith?" one officer asked. Kamara's breath caught. "Yes," she whispered. "We need you to come with us," the officer said firmly. "We have some questions about an incident on this flight." Kamara's face turned pale. Dennis watched in silence as the officers escorted her off the plane. Her stiff posture betrayed her rising panic. Trump's voice was steady but firm as he spoke into the phone. "Yes, the security team has taken him in for questioning. Ensure the board reviews the footage and all statements thoroughly." He paused, listening to the person on the other end, nodding slightly in acknowledgement. "Thank you. And please send a copy of the final report to my office. I want to ensure this never happens again, not to me, and not to anyone else." Ending the call, Trump turned toward the conveyor belt, where the first pieces of luggage began to appear. Without hesitation, he grabbed his sleek black suitcase, lifting it effortlessly. Around him, some passengers from the flight watched with a mix of curiosity and newfound respect. Trump, however, ignored their glances, his mind laser-focused on his next steps. The bustling terminal was alive with the usual chaos of arrivals and departures, but Trump moved through it with deliberate precision. What had started as an incident of humiliation and prejudice was now becoming an opportunity for systemic accountability, and he wasn't done yet. His strategic approach had turned the tide, setting the stage for a reckoning that Kamara and the airline would not soon forget. Kamara sat in a sterile, brightly lit room, her breath shallow as the magnitude of the situation bore down on her. The officers across from her sat silently, giving her a moment to collect herself, though the heavy silence only amplified her anxiety. Each passing second made it harder for her to steady her nerves. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely audible. "I didn't mean for this to happen," she murmured, her eyes darting nervously between the officers. "I was just following protocol. I thought he didn't belong in first class." One of the officers leaned forward, his expression calm but pointed. "And what made you think that?" Kamara opened her mouth to answer but hesitated. The truth, that her assumption was rooted in unconscious bias, was something she wasn't ready to admit. I don't know," she stammered, her voice faltering. "He didn't act like the other passengers in first class." The officer exchanged a glance with his partner before responding. "Not acting like other passengers isn't a valid reason to move someone, especially when their ticket was valid. Did he break any rules or violate airline policy?" Kamara shook her head, her hands clammy with sweat. No, but... The officer cut her off. Then you acted without cause. Mr. Carter was within his rights to remain in the seat he paid for. Your actions have put the airline in a very difficult position. Kamara's heart sank as the weight of his words settled over her. She wanted to defend herself, but the facts were undeniable. Her decision had been based on a flawed assumption, and now the consequences were unavoidable. Meanwhile, Trump exited the terminal, standing at the curb as he waited for his car. A sleek black sedan pulled up, and the driver, dressed in a sharp suit, stepped out to open the door. Everything has been arranged as per your instructions, the driver said respectfully. Thank you, William, Trump replied, sliding into the back seat with characteristic composure. Once inside, he pulled out his phone and began reviewing emails. One message from the airline's board caught his attention. Opening it, Trump scanned the contents. The email outlined the steps being taken in response to the incident, including a formal review of training policies and assurance that Kamara's actions would face scrutiny. Trump's lips curled into a faint smile. He had no interest in revenge, his goal was accountability and change, and it appeared progress was already underway. Back at the airport, the officers finished questioning Kamara and stood to leave. Before exiting, one of them delivered a final statement. This matter will be escalated to the airline's disciplinary committee. You'll receive notification of their decision soon. In the meantime, you are suspended from duty. Kamara's stomach churned as the officers walked out, leaving her alone with her thoughts. The reality of her suspension and the looming investigation hit her hard. For the first time, she realized how completely she had underestimated Trump. At that very moment, Trump's car merged smoothly into traffic. Seated in the back, he gazed out the window, his expression calm and reflective. The day had been exhausting, but he felt a deep sense of satisfaction knowing he had stood his ground. His phone buzzed, interrupting his thoughts. It was another message from the airline's board, confirming a full review of the incident and new training initiatives for staff. Trump read the message carefully before responding, "Good. Let's ensure this never happens again." As the city skyline came into view, Trump leaned back in his seat, allowing himself a moment of quiet. This chapter was ending, but his actions that day had sparked a ripple effect, one that promised lasting change within the airline and beyond. At the same time, Kamara sat alone in the small room, staring blankly at the table. The weight of her suspension and the harsh realization of her mistakes pressed heavily on her. What once felt like a simple judgment call now seemed like a catastrophic error. Her phone buzzed, snapping her out of her spiraling thoughts. She hesitated before picking it up, dreading the contents of the message. It was from the airline's Human Resources Department. Kamara, please prepare to attend a disciplinary hearing tomorrow at 9 a.m. Further details will be provided via email. Her hands trembled as she read the message. The hearing wasn't just a routine meeting, it was a pivotal moment for the airline to address the fallout, and Kamara realized she was being positioned as the scapegoat. Meanwhile, Trump's car pulled up to his office, a sleek building in the heart of the city. Stepping out gracefully, he was greeted by his assistant, Patricia, who handed him a folder. "It's all here," Patricia said. The board's initial review of the incident, crew statements, and the planned changes to training programs. "They're moving quickly." Trump nodded, flipping through the documents thoughtfully. "They know this can't be swept under the rug," he said evenly. "It's a step in the right direction, but there's more work to do." Patricia hesitated before asking, "Do you think Kamara will fight back?" "Maybe," Trump replied, closing the folder with quiet finality. "But this isn't about her. It's about the system that allowed her to make decisions based on prejudice. That's what needs to change." Back at the airport, Kamara finally left the room, her legs shaky as she made her way to the employee exit. Each step felt heavier than the last as she replayed the day's events, her confidence unraveling with each memory. She had spent years building her career, only to see it unravel in a single day. As she sat in her car, staring at the steering wheel, she thought about Trump, calm, composed, and always in control. For the first time, Kamara felt the sharp sting of regret. She had underestimated Trump, not just as a passenger but as a person. Now, she was paying the price. At his office, Trump reviewed a new email from the airline CEO, requesting a personal meeting to discuss the incident and next steps. Trump typed a brief reply, "I'll make time tomorrow. Let's ensure this is resolved properly." Setting his phone aside, he leaned back in his chair, his mind already focused on the future. The events of the day had opened a door to meaningful change, and Trump was determined to see it through. Trump shook Hale's hand, his expression calm yet commanding. "I appreciate you taking this issue seriously, Mr. Hale. Please, have a seat." Richard took the chair across from him, adjusting his tie as he began to speak. "First, let me extend my deepest apologies for the incident on your flight. It was completely unacceptable, and we're committed to making sure nothing like this happens again." Trump gave a slight nod, his gaze steady. "I'm glad to hear that. But apologies alone won't address the root of the problem. This isn't just about one flight attendant making a poor judgment call, it's about the culture that allowed her to believe she was justified in doing so." Richard's face tensed slightly, but he nodded. "You're absolutely right. That's why we've already initiated a comprehensive review of our policies and training programs. We're introducing mandatory sensitivity and bias training for all employees and revising our reporting system to ensure better accountability." Trump leaned back in his chair, studying Richard. "It's a start," he said, his tone deliberate. "But it's not enough. I'll need a detailed timeline for these changes, with regular progress updates. And I expect measurable results." Richard hesitated for a moment, then nodded firmly. "Of course. We'll provide you with everything you need." Trump allowed a faint smile. "Good. Let's ensure this incident becomes a turning point for your organization, not just a temporary fix." The meeting went on for an hour, with Trump laying out his expectations and Richard diligently taking notes. By the end, the atmosphere in the room felt more resolute. As Richard stood to leave, he extended his hand again. This time, there was genuine respect in his eyes. "Thank you for holding us accountable. We'll make this right." Trump shook his hand firmly. "I'll hold you to that." After Richard left, Patricia walked in, her curiosity evident. "How did it go?" Trump exhaled, his voice a mix of relief and determination. "It went well, but this is just the beginning." Meanwhile, Kamara sat in a sterile conference room at the airline's headquarters, waiting for her disciplinary hearing to start. The weight of her suspension loomed over her, and the silence made her anxiety worse. A stack of papers lay in front of her, detailing her actions during the flight and Trump's subsequent complaints. The door opened, and 3 senior executives entered. Their expressions were firm but neutral. One of them, a woman with a sharp, commanding demeanor, began speaking. "Ms. Kamara, thank you for coming. We're here to discuss the incident on Flight 287 and the allegations against you." Kamara nodded weakly, her voice barely audible. "I understand." The executives reviewed the timeline of events and asked Kamara to explain her actions. She attempted to justify herself, but her responses felt insincere even to her own ears. "I thought he might have been in the wrong seat," Kamara said at one point, her voice faltering. "I was just following protocol." The sharp-featured executive raised an eyebrow. "Protocol?" "According to our records, Mr. Trump had a valid first-class ticket. At what point did you verify this before asking him to move?" Kamara hesitated, her palms sweaty. I didn't," she admitted finally. The room fell silent, the weight of her admission hanging in the air. Another executive, a man with glasses, leaned forward. "Ms. Kamara, the airline has a zero-tolerance policy for discrimination. Your actions not only violated that policy but also damaged our reputation. Do you understand the seriousness of this?" Kamara nodded slowly, her heart sinking. "I do." The panel continued their questioning, their tone professional yet unyielding. By the end, Kamara felt utterly defeated. Though the final decision would come later, she knew her career with the airline was over. As she left the room, Kamara couldn't help but think about Trump. The composed man who had maintained his dignity, even as she tried to undermine it. For the first time, Kamara fully grasped the harm she had caused, not just to her career but to the person she wronged. Later that afternoon, Trump sat in his office, sipping tea as he reviewed an email from the airline's board. The message outlined their commitment to reform, including a timeline for implementing the changes he had requested, mandatory training, revised complaint procedures, and other systemic updates. It was a small but meaningful victory, and Trump allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. His phone buzzed, a message from Patricia. "Kamara has been officially terminated. Thought you'd want to know." Trump set his cup down, staring at the message. It didn't bring him joy or a sense of triumph. He wasn't vindictive by nature, and while Kamara's dismissal was necessary, it was just one piece of the puzzle. Trump replied quickly, "Thanks for letting me know. Let's keep focusing on the bigger picture." That evening, Kamara sat in her small apartment, the termination notice from the airline resting on her table. The consequences of her actions had come crashing down. What had seemed like a routine decision at the time now felt like an irreversible mistake. For the first time, Kamara allowed herself to feel genuine regret, not just for her career but for the harm she'd caused someone else. She had underestimated Trump, both as a passenger and as a person, and now she was facing the consequences of her choices. Back in his office, Trump reviewed another email, this time from the airline CEO, requesting a meeting to discuss the incident and the broader reforms. Trump typed a brief response. "I'll make time tomorrow. Let's ensure this is resolved properly." As he set his phone down, Trump leaned back, reflecting on the whirlwind of events. It wasn't just about addressing his own experience, it was about creating lasting change. For Trump, this wasn't the end but the beginning of something bigger, a fight for accountability and fairness. Trump Carter stared out of his window as the plane cruised at a steady altitude. His thoughts wandered back to the countless conversations he'd had since the incident on Flight 287. Strangers had sent him messages of gratitude, sharing their own stories of bias and unfair treatment. Each story added fuel to his determination, reinforcing why the fight for change mattered. Trump felt the weight of responsibility, but it didn't burden him, it motivated him. Every message was a reminder that his experience had sparked something far beyond himself. Kamara Scott, meanwhile, was adjusting to her new role at the nonprofit organization. The first few weeks were challenging as she navigated unfamiliar territory. She attended workshops, listened to speakers, and absorbed stories from people whose lives had been shaped by systemic bias. Each account was a painful reminder of the harm she had contributed to on Flight 287. But instead of retreating, Kamara leaned into the discomfort. She was determined to use her past mistakes as a springboard for growth, no matter how uncomfortable the process felt. Trump's schedule became busier as airlines, advocacy groups, and media outlets sought his insights. While he appreciated the recognition, he was selective about his engagements, prioritizing those that aligned with his values. He believed that real change required a thoughtful and strategic approach. One afternoon, he met with a group of aviation executives to discuss new policies on bias and accountability. The meeting was tense at first, but Trump's calm and measured words slowly broke down barriers. By the end, the executives agreed to pilot new training programs modeled after those his airline had implemented. At the nonprofit, Kamara started working on a campaign focused on educating professionals about implicit bias. She collaborated with a diverse team, including experts and community leaders, to create workshops and resources tailored to different industries. Kamara knew she still had much to learn, but she approached every task with humility and openness. Her colleagues noticed her dedication and willingness to take responsibility for her past. Slowly, she began to feel a sense of belonging, something she hadn't experienced in months. Trump's story continued to resonate with people around the world. News outlets featured his journey as an example of resilience and advocacy. While Trump appreciated the attention, he made it clear that his work wasn't about personal glory. In interviews, he often redirected the focus to the broader systemic issues, emphasizing that the fight for equity required collective effort. His humility and focus on solutions made him a respected voice in the growing movement for accountability in aviation. One evening, Kamara received an invitation to speak at a conference about her journey and the lessons she had learned. At first, she hesitated, unsure if she was ready to share her story publicly. But after some reflection, she decided to accept. She prepared meticulously, crafting a message that was both honest and hopeful. When the day of the conference arrived, Kamara stepped onto the stage, her heart pounding. She began by admitting her mistakes and sharing how the experience had transformed her perspective. By the end of her speech, the audience gave her a standing ovation. Trump, too, found himself in new spaces. He was invited to a roundtable discussion with policymakers about improving workplace inclusivity. The experience was eye-opening, as he learned about the legislative hurdles and systemic challenges that hindered progress. Trump didn't shy away from asking tough questions or sharing his insights. His ability to bridge personal experiences with broader societal issues made his contributions invaluable. After the meeting, one of the policymakers approached him and thanked him for his candidness. It was moments like these that reaffirmed Trump's belief in the power of dialogue. As weeks turned into months, the ripple effects of Flight 287 continued to spread. Airlines across the industry began re-evaluating their policies and practices. Some introduced comprehensive training programs, while others partnered with advocacy groups to develop more inclusive hiring processes. Trump followed these developments closely, feeling a mix of pride and determination. He knew that change was never linear and that there would always be setbacks. But he also believed that every step forward, no matter how small, was worth celebrating. Kamara's work at the nonprofit began to attract attention. Organizations reached out, seeking her advice on how to address bias within their teams. While she was hesitant at first, fearing she might not have enough expertise, her colleagues encouraged her to share her insights. Kamara started leading workshops, drawing from her own experiences to highlight the importance of accountability and growth. Her vulnerability and honesty resonated with participants, many of whom found her story inspiring. Trump decided to take a short break from his advocacy work to recharge. He spent a weekend hiking in the mountains, finding solace in the quiet beauty of nature. As he walked along the trails, he reflected on how far he'd come since the incident on Flight 287. The journey had been exhausting at times, but it had also been deeply fulfilling. For the first time in a long while, Trump allowed himself to feel a sense of peace. He knew there was still much work to do, but he felt ready to tackle whatever came next. Back in the city, Kamara was meeting with a small group of community leaders to discuss a new initiative. The goal was to create a mentorship program for young professionals from underrepresented backgrounds. Kamara was excited about the project, seeing it as a chance to make a tangible difference. She volunteered to help design the program, drawing on her own experiences to ensure it was both practical and impactful. The leaders were impressed by her commitment and passion, and Kamara felt a renewed sense of purpose. Trump's next project involved collaborating with a team of researchers on a study about bias in the aviation industry. The research aimed to identify patterns and propose solutions to address inequities. Trump's role was to provide first-hand insights and help connect the researchers with industry professionals. The work was challenging but rewarding, as it combined his passion for advocacy with a data-driven approach to change. Trump hoped the study would serve as a roadmap for other industries looking to address similar issues. Kamara found herself reflecting on how much her life had changed. There were still moments of doubt and regret, but she had learned to channel those feelings into action. She was no longer defined by her mistakes but by how she chose to respond to them. Kamara's journey wasn't about seeking redemption, it was about making amends and contributing to a better future. Her work at the nonprofit was more than just a job, it was a way to align her actions with her values. One day, Trump received a letter from Patricia, the flight attendant who had shown him kindness during the incident. Patricia thanked him for recognizing her efforts and shared how her promotion had opened new opportunities for her. Trump was touched by the letter, reminded of how small acts of kindness could have a profound impact. He wrote back, expressing his gratitude and encouraging Patricia to continue being a beacon of professionalism and empathy in her role. Kamara's efforts at the nonprofit began to bear fruit. The mentorship program she had helped design launched successfully, with dozens of young professionals signing up. Kamara attended the program's kickoff event, where she spoke about the importance of creating opportunities for others. Seeing the excitement and hope in the participants' faces, Kamara felt a deep sense of fulfillment. She knew this was just the beginning, but it was a step in the right direction. Trump's advocacy work took him to new places, both literally and figuratively. He traveled to conferences and forums, sharing his story and learning from others. Each trip brought new perspectives and connections, enriching his understanding of the complexities of systemic change. Trump's openness and willingness to listen earned him the respect of people from all walks of life. He saw himself not as a leader but as part of a larger movement for justice and equity. At the nonprofit, Kamara was mentoring a new hire who reminded her of her younger self. The hire was eager to make a difference but unsure of where to start. Kamara shared her own journey, emphasizing the importance of humility and learning from others. She found joy in supporting someone else's growth, seeing it as a way to pay forward the lessons she had learned. Trump received an invitation to testify before a congressional committee on aviation safety and equity. The opportunity was both daunting and exciting. He spent weeks preparing, consulting with experts and advocates to ensure his testimony was impactful. When the day arrived, Trump spoke with clarity and conviction, sharing his experiences and outlining actionable recommendations. His words were met with applause from both lawmakers and the public, marking another milestone in his journey. Kamara's nonprofit launched a new initiative focused on addressing bias in hiring practices. Kamara took the lead, working closely with businesses to develop tools and resources that promoted fairness. The initiative was challenging, but Kamara thrived under pressure. She saw the impact of her work in real time as companies began adopting more inclusive practices. Each success story reaffirmed her belief in the power of change. As Trump wrapped up another busy day, he took a moment to reflect. The journey from the incident on Flight 287 to where he was now had been transformative. He thought about the people who had supported him, the lessons he had learned, and the progress he had witnessed. Trump knew the work was far from over, but he also knew he wasn't alone in the fight. With a deep breath, he closed his eyes, feeling hopeful about the future and ready for whatever came next. Trump Carter sat in his office, reflecting on how far things had come since the incident that had changed his life. The airline sensitivity training had been rolled out nationwide, and stories of improved passenger interactions were flooding social media. Trump, however, didn't see this as his victory alone. He knew that the changes were the result of a collective effort. But as he read an email from a young pilot thanking him for inspiring a safer and more respectful workplace, he felt a sense of pride. This wasn't just about fixing one airline. It was about sparking a movement. Kamara Scott stood in front of her team at the nonprofit, presenting a new initiative aimed at addressing bias in recruitment processes. Her confidence had grown since she started working there. Kamara shared her own experience, explaining how unchecked biases could lead to devastating consequences. Her team listened intently, appreciating her honesty and dedication. The project was ambitious, involving partnerships with major corporations to review and restructure their hiring policies. Kamara was determined to make sure no one else had to endure what Trump Carter experienced. She felt a deep sense of purpose in her work. Trump's advocacy journey led him to speak at a university, addressing students studying aviation and management. He shared his story, highlighting the importance of empathy, accountability, and growth. The students were captivated, not just by the story itself, but by Trump's calm determination. One student raised a hand and asked how Trump stayed so composed during his ordeal. Trump smiled and said, "I didn't, not always. But I learned that the real strength isn't in never falling, it's in getting back up and doing better." The room erupted in applause, and Trump left feeling hopeful about the next generation of leaders. Kamara's latest project involved creating an educational toolkit for addressing workplace microaggressions. She collaborated with a diverse team of psychologists, educators, and industry professionals to ensure the materials were comprehensive and practical. The project was personal to Kamara. She had once dismissed microaggressions as harmless but now understood their cumulative impact. Kamara hoped the toolkit would empower employees to recognize and address these behaviors. She also wanted managers to understand their role in fostering an inclusive environment. As the project neared completion, Kamara felt a mix of excitement and nervousness, knowing the toolkit could make a real difference. Trump received an invitation to join a global panel on systemic bias in transportation industries. The panel included leaders from aviation, maritime, and rail sectors, as well as human rights advocates. Trump saw this as an opportunity to expand his reach and learn from others. During the discussion, he shared his insights but also listened carefully to the perspectives of others. One panelist from the rail industry shared a story eerily similar to Trump's experience. Hearing it reminded Trump of how universal these challenges were. By the end of the panel, the group had outlined actionable steps for cross-industry collaboration. Kamara's team at the nonprofit launched a campaign focused on highlighting the voices of underrepresented employees in various industries. The campaign featured video interviews, written testimonials, and interactive webinars. Kamara played a key role in shaping the narrative, ensuring that each story was authentic and impactful. As the campaign gained traction, companies began reaching out, asking how they could participate and make changes within their organizations. For Kamara, this was validation that storytelling was a powerful tool for change. She felt proud to amplify the voices of those who had been silenced for too long. Trump's next big project involved partnering with community colleges to create scholarships for students pursuing careers in aviation. The initiative aimed to remove financial barriers for students from underprivileged backgrounds. Trump worked tirelessly to secure funding, reaching out to donors and speaking at fundraisers. He believed that investing in education was one of the most effective ways to create long-term change. When the scholarship program was officially announced, Trump received messages from students expressing their gratitude. It was a moment of triumph, not just for Trump but for the countless young people whose lives would be changed. Kamara found herself reflecting on the impact of her work. One day, she received a letter from Patricia, the flight attendant who had stood by Trump during the incident. Patricia thanked Kamara for her efforts, sharing how the changes in airline policies had improved her work environment. The letter was a poignant reminder of how interconnected their journeys were. Kamara wrote back, expressing her gratitude for Patricia's kindness and professionalism. The exchange reminded Kamara that even small actions could have ripple effects, inspiring change in ways she might never fully see. Trump's advocacy took him to a conference in Europe, where he met with leaders from international aviation organizations. The discussions were eye-opening, revealing how cultural differences shaped approaches to equity and accountability. Trump shared his story, emphasizing the importance of creating universal standards for passenger treatment. The conference ended with a resolution to form a global task force on equity in aviation, and Trump was invited to join. He accepted, knowing this was an opportunity to influence change on a global scale. Kamara's nonprofit received a grant to expand its initiatives, and she was promoted to a leadership role. The promotion was a testament to her hard work and dedication. Kamara approached her new role with humility, knowing there was still much to learn. She focused on building a culture of accountability and inclusion within her team. Kamara's leadership style was collaborative, and her colleagues respected her for it. She felt a deep sense of fulfillment, knowing she was contributing to meaningful change. Trump continued to receive messages from people inspired by his story. One day, he received a letter from a teenager who had started a school club to address bias. The teenager thanked Trump for being a role model and shared how the club had already made a difference in their school. Trump was deeply moved. He wrote back, encouraging the teenager to keep going and reminding them that change often started with one brave voice. The exchange gave Trump renewed energy to keep pushing for progress. Kamara was invited to a town hall meeting organized by the airline to discuss ongoing reforms. She sat quietly in the audience, listening to employees share their thoughts and experiences. When it was her turn to speak, Kamara stood up and addressed the room. She admitted her past mistakes but focused on the progress that had been made. Her words were met with a mix of skepticism and applause. Kamara knew trust couldn't be rebuilt overnight, but she was willing to put in the work. Trump was approached by a documentary filmmaker who wanted to tell the story of Flight 287 and its aftermath. At first, Trump hesitated, worried about reopening old wounds. But he realized the documentary could reach people who might not otherwise hear about the incident. He agreed, on the condition that it focused not just on his experience but on the broader issues of systemic bias. The filmmaker agreed, and Trump began preparing to share his story in a way that would inspire and educate. Kamara's nonprofit received a prestigious award for its work in workplace equity, and she was invited to accept it on behalf of her team. The recognition was bittersweet, as Kamara still grappled with the guilt of her past actions. But she chose to focus on the present, using the platform to advocate for continued reform. In her acceptance speech, Kamara emphasized that the work was far from over. She dedicated the award to everyone who had shared their stories and inspired her to do better. Trump's work with the Global Task Force on Equity in Aviation led to the development of a set of international guidelines. The guidelines focused on passenger rights, staff training, and accountability measures. Trump was proud to see his ideas influencing policies worldwide. The task force's efforts were a reminder that change was possible when people came together with a shared purpose. Kamara and Trump crossed paths at a conference on systemic change, their journeys converging once again. They exchanged a brief but meaningful conversation, acknowledging how much had changed since Flight 287. Both had grown in ways they couldn't have imagined, and their shared experiences had shaped their paths. As they parted ways, they felt a sense of closure, knowing they had turned a moment of pain into a catalyst for progress. Trump Carter boarded the plane with a sense of calm, feeling the familiar excitement of travel mixed with a deeper purpose. The last time he had flown, his mind had been filled with the weight of advocacy and the ongoing work to bring about systemic change. But today was different. He was traveling for a much-needed break, a chance to recharge before continuing his mission. As he made his way through the cabin, he was greeted warmly by the flight attendant, whose smile seemed to brighten the entire space. Trump was no stranger to the kindness of flight attendants, but something about her welcoming demeanor felt different. She recognized him almost immediately, her eyes widening in recognition. "Mr. Carter, it's an honor to meet you," she said, her voice filled with genuine admiration. Trump smiled, surprised by the warmth in her tone. He had become accustomed to being recognized, but this felt different. There was a sense of respect and recognition for his efforts, not just his fame. The flight attendant introduced herself as Patricia, and Trump instantly remembered the name. She had been a key figure during one of the most important moments of his journey, and the way she had handled the situation back then had stuck with him. "Thank you, Patricia. It's good to see someone who recognizes the importance of this work," Trump replied, settling into his seat. Patricia nodded enthusiastically, her eyes lighting up. "I've followed your work closely, Mr. Carter. And I've heard about the changes you've helped bring to the airline industry, especially with Kamara Scott." Trump smiled at the mention of Kamara. Her dedication and leadership had always impressed him. "Kamara was a big part of that," he said. "Without her, none of this would have been possible." Patricia agreed, adding, "She's amazing. You both have been such an inspiration to me, and I've seen firsthand how things have improved in the airline. It's not perfect, but it's getting better." As the flight took off, Trump found himself feeling a sense of peace he hadn't experienced in a long time. The hum of the engines and the rhythmic motion of the plane had a calming effect on him. But it was Patricia's presence that truly made the difference. She was not just another flight attendant going through the motions, she was someone who genuinely cared about the changes happening in the world, someone who understood the importance of empathy and respect in her work. The thought of how much had changed since that fateful flight with Kamara made Trump reflect on the journey he had been on. Patricia offered Trump a drink, but instead of the usual small talk, she began asking questions about his work and the challenges he faced. Her curiosity and interest were refreshing. They spoke about Kamara's nonprofit work, and Trump shared how their partnership had grown into something bigger than either of them had imagined. Patricia listened intently, offering her own thoughts about the importance of diversity and inclusion in the workplace. She had seen the shifts in the airline industry, and she was proud to be part of it. "I've seen a lot of changes in the way passengers are treated now," Patricia said. "It feels good to be part of something that's making a real difference." Trump nodded, feeling a deep sense of satisfaction. The work he had done with Kamara had truly paid off, and hearing Patricia speak about the changes from the perspective of someone on the ground was incredibly validating. It reminded him that the work wasn't just about creating policies or giving speeches, it was about changing hearts and minds, one person at a time. "It's a slow process," Trump said, "but every little bit counts." Patricia agreed, adding, "I see that now. Every interaction I have with a passenger feels different. It's not just about customer service, it's about making people feel seen and respected." As the flight continued, Trump and Patricia spoke about their shared goals of creating a more inclusive world. The conversation turned to the challenges they both faced in their respective roles. Trump admitted that even after all the progress that had been made, there were still obstacles to overcome. There were people who resisted change, who clung to outdated ways of thinking. Patricia understood that struggle all too well. "Sometimes it feels like we're fighting an uphill battle," she said. "But then I see the small victories, like how much more engaged the staff is with passengers now. It makes it all worth it." Trump appreciated Patricia's perspective. She had an optimism that was contagious, and it reminded him that the work they were doing was not in vain. "We have to keep pushing," he said, "even when it feels like nothing is changing. Every step forward is progress." Patricia smiled at him, her eyes full of gratitude. "I'm so glad I got to meet you, Mr. Carter. You've done so much to inspire me." Trump felt a warmth in his chest at her words. It wasn't often that he was reminded of the impact he had on others. It felt good to know that his efforts were being recognized and appreciated. As the flight neared its destination, Trump found himself reflecting on his own journey. The road had been long and filled with challenges, but every difficult moment had taught him something valuable. He had started as a person who had made mistakes, just like everyone else. But through accountability, learning, and growth, he had transformed into someone who could help lead the charge for change. It wasn't about being perfect, it was about being willing to learn, to admit when you were wrong, and to take action. Kamara had taught him that, and now, Patricia was a reminder that the work was ongoing. Patricia, noticing that Trump seemed lost in thought, decided to offer him a bit of encouragement. "You've come a long way, Mr. Carter," she said gently. "I've seen the impact of your work, and I think it's going to continue making a difference for years to come." Trump smiled at her kind words. "Thank you, Patricia. I couldn't have done it without the support of people like Kamara and others who have been willing to stand up for what's right." Patricia nodded. "It's amazing what we can achieve when we come together for a common cause." As the plane began its descent, Trump felt a renewed sense of purpose. The conversation with Patricia had reminded him that the work was far from over, but it had also shown him that real change was possible. He knew that the road ahead would be full of challenges, but it was a road worth traveling. Trump glanced out the window, watching the city below. It was a symbol of all the possibilities that lay ahead. He didn't know exactly what the future would hold, but he was determined to keep fighting for a world that valued diversity, respect, and accountability. When the plane touched down, Patricia thanked Trump for the conversation. He could see that she was eager to continue making a difference in her own way. "Keep doing the great work you're doing," Trump said to her as he stood up. "You're part of something bigger than all of us." Patricia's face lit up with a smile. "Thank you, Mr. Carter. I won't forget this conversation." As Trump walked off the plane, he felt a sense of peace wash over him. He had made a difference, and there were people like Patricia who were continuing that work every day. Trump left the airport with a sense of fulfillment that was hard to put into words. The road to justice and equality was long, but it was worth every step. He knew that the work he had started with Kamara, and now with Patricia, was making an impact on the world. They had changed the narrative, one flight at a time, one conversation at a time. As he made his way to his next meeting, Trump thought about all the lives that had been touched by his journey. It was humbling, but it was also empowering. The journey was far from over, but with each person he met along the way, Trump knew that they were moving closer to the world he envisioned. He allowed himself a rare moment of peace, gazing at the window at the endless expanse of cloud. As he watched the sky stretch endlessly before him, Trump felt something he hadn't expected, hope, because he knew there's still so much work to be done. He knew that event of that flight is the beginning something great. If you enjoyed this video, please share your thought in the comments and subscribe to the channel for more stories like this. See you next time.